I have delivered half the babies in this parish and closed the eyes of most of their grandparents, and in 50 years of doctoring, I never saw a church come apart at the seams the way St. Aldrich's did on the morning Miss Eleanor Vance was meant to become a bride. I was sitting in the fourth pew with my black bag at my feet, out of habit more than need, when the doors at the back banged open, and a woman's voice cut through the organ music like a scythe through wheat. That was the moment it began. Everything after, the scandal, the wonder, the marriage that saved her, grew out of those next 4 minutes, and I watched every second of it from where I sat, close enough to see the color drain from the groom's face and close enough later to see something else entirely kindle in the Duke's. I should tell you plainly who these people were, since you will want the shape of it before I give you the color. Eleanor Vance was 23 that spring, the only child of Josiah Vance, a naturalist of modest means and immodest devotion to his work, who had spent 30 years cataloging the wild flowers and hedgerow plants of our corner of the county, with a thoroughness that the Royal Society itself might have envied. Had the Royal Society ever troubled to notice a man who published his findings in pamphlets stitched together at the kitchen table? Eleanor had grown up pressing petals between the pages of her father's ledgers, learning Latin names before she learned to dance properly, and she had her father's plain-spoken honesty in a face that was handsome rather than fashionable, strong-boned, clear-eyed, quick to color when she was angry and quicker still to laugh when she was not. She was not a beauty in the way the county understood beauty. She was something better, though it took a particular kind of man to see it, and the man she was marrying that morning was not that kind. His name was Mr. Aldous Pemberton, and he was the second son of a family with more pride than land, and he had courted Eleanor for a year with a persistence that her father had mistaken for genuine feeling. I had my doubts of him from the first. A physician learns to read a pulse, and there is a pulse to a man's affections too, if you know where to press your fingers, and Pemberton's ran cold and calculating beneath all his pretty words. But Josiah Vance was a trusting soul who saw goodness in every specimen he examined, whether leaf or lover, and Eleanor wanted, I think, simply to be chosen. She had spent so many years being overlooked in favor of louder, richer, more conventionally lovely girls that, when Pemberton fixed his attention on her, she let herself believe it was love, and not merely the absence of a better offer. She should have trusted her own instruments of measurement. She had been trained by her father to observe closely, to distrust appearances, to test a specimen before naming it. She simply had not thought to apply the same rigor to a suitor's heart. I do not fault her for it. We are all fools once in matters of the heart before we learn to be wise. The other figure in this history I must introduce is the Duke of Harrogate, whom the county had taken to calling the Sable Duke, for the darkness of his hair, the somberness of his dress, and a reserve so complete that strangers mistook it for coldness. His given name was Gerald Ashworth, though I do not know that I ever heard 3 people use it in a year. He had inherited the title and the estate of Harrogate at 1820, upon the sudden death of his elder brother, and grief and duty together had pressed something hard and quiet into him that had not, I think, been there before. He was not an old man, perhaps 35 that spring, but he carried himself like one who had already buried more than his share of what he loved, and he trusted very little and revealed less. He had known Eleanor's mother, Margaret Vance, in his boyhood, for she had been a friend of his own mother's before her early death, and it was in her memory, or so everyone assumed, that he had accepted the invitation to Eleanor's wedding. He kept himself apart from the county's usual entertainments, and his presence at a modest naturalist's daughter's wedding was remarked upon by everyone who noticed him take his seat that morning, alone in the second pew from the back, dressed in his customary dark coat, his expression giving away nothing at all. I did not know then, though I came to know it later, and shall tell you in its proper place, that he had been watching Eleanor Vance for the better part of a year with an attention far keener than mere memory of her mother could account for. I did not know that he had sat in the shadow of village lectures on native flora, unremarked in the back row, to hear her read her father's notes aloud when the old man's eyes grew too tired for it. I did not know any of that on the morning of the wedding. I knew only that a duke had come to a small church to see a naturalist's daughter married, and that he sat very still, and that his eyes, when they rested on the bride at all, rested a moment longer than courtesy required. The church was full that morning, fuller than such a modest match would ordinarily draw, for word had gone about that the groom's family had connections worth cultivating, and half the county had turned out on the strength of curiosity, and cold cuts promised at the wedding breakfast. Eleanor came up the aisle on her father's arm in a gown that had been her mother's, remade with care by the dressmaker in the village, trimmed simply, without excess of lace or jewel, because that was all the Vances could afford, and because Eleanor had never been a girl to want more than she could honestly wear. She carried a bouquet that told you everything about her before she said a word. Not hothouse roses, not orange blossom bought in from the city, but a gathering of wild flowers and herbs from her father's own garden, tied with plain ribbon, chosen, I learned later, species by species, for what they meant. Rosemary for remembrance of her mother. Forget-me-not, naturally. A sprig of yarrow, which her father's books called a flower of healing and of courage both. She had built her own bouquet like a sentence, meaning every word of it, and she walked up that aisle with her chin level and her back straight, the plainest, proudest bride scent Aldrich's had seen in a generation. I watched the Duke watch her walk, and I confess I did not understand then what I was seeing. The vicar had scarcely begun the service. We had not yet reached the vows, only the opening exhortations, the ancient words about the causes for which matrimony was ordained, when the church doors opened a second time, not with the soft creak of a late guest slipping in, but with a crash that turned every head in the nave. A woman entered first, sumptuously dressed, trailing furs too heavy for the season, and behind her came an older gentleman I did not recognize, and behind him, a thin man in black carrying a leather folio under his arm in the manner of a man whose entire purpose in a room is to make other men uneasy. "Forgive the interruption," the woman announced in a voice pitched for the last pew, but I could not in conscience let this proceed. Her name, I would learn within the hour, was Miss Cordelia Whitmore, only daughter of a mill owner whose fortune had multiplied itself twice over in the last 3 years through means that were spoken of in the county with a mixture of envy and distaste. She had met Aldous Pemberton, it transpired, at an assembly in the county town not 2 months before, and in that time a correspondence had sprung up between them that Pemberton had kept entirely from Eleanor's knowledge. The thin man with the folio was her father's solicitor, and the folio itself, as it turned out, contained a settlement, a dowry offer so far beyond anything the Vance family could conceive of that Pemberton's face, when he heard the sum named aloud a few moments later, took on the naked, avaricious look of a man watching a horse he had backed come thundering home. I will not pretend that what followed unfolded with any dignity on Pemberton's part. He stammered. He looked from Eleanor to Cordelia Whitmore and back again, and in that hesitation alone he told the whole church everything it needed to know about the quality of his affection. Old Vance rose half out of his seat, sputtering, demanding an explanation, and the vicar stood with his prayer book open and forgotten in his hand, uncertain whether he was meant to continue a wedding that had, in the space of half a minute, ceased to have a groom worth marrying. Aldous, Eleanor said his name once quietly, and there was something in the quiet of it that silenced the murmuring congregation faster than any shout could have. "Look at me and tell me it is not true." He could not do it. He opened his mouth, and what came out of it instead was an apology so mealy and so miserably practical, something about his family's circumstances, about obligations she could not understand, about how a man in his position could not be expected to turn away a chance at security, that I heard, from several pews back, an old farm wife mutter something extremely uncharitable under her breath, and I silently agreed with every word of it. Eleanor did not weep. That is the thing I most wish you to understand about her, and the thing the county talked about for years afterward, long after the scandal itself had faded into legend. She stood in her mother's remade gown with her wildflower bouquet trembling only slightly in her hands, and she looked at the man who had courted her for a year and was abandoning her in a church full of witnesses for a heavier purse, and she did not fall to pieces. Her eyes went bright and her jaw went tight, and 2 spots of color rose high on her cheeks, but she did not weep, not there, not in front of them. "Then I will not trouble you further," she said, "nor Miss Whitmore, who I am sure has better uses for her father's money than purchasing so poor an investment." There was a gasp somewhere in the crowd, and I confess a most undignified bark of laughter escaped me before I mastered it, because it was, God forgive me, very funny and very true, and very much the sort of thing her father's plain speaking had bred into her. But laughter could not carry her through what came next, which was the simple, brutal fact that she was standing at the front of a packed church, jilted before witnesses, with nowhere honorable to go but out through the doors at the back, alone, past every staring face in the county. She turned. She lifted her chin higher, not lower, and she began to walk back down the aisle she had just come up as a bride and would now leave as nothing at all, not a bride, not quite a spinster by any formal reckoning, but a woman publicly discarded, which in the eyes of that county was very often considered worse. It was in that walk, in those first few steps back down the aisle with the whole church's pity and cruelty mingling on her like a physical weight, that the second great disruption of the morning occurred, and this one I watched more closely than any event I have witnessed before or since, because I happened to be seated almost directly across from where it began. The Duke of Harrogate rose from his pew. He did it without haste, and without the fumbling embarrassment of a man merely trying to get a better view of a scandal. He rose the way a man rises when he has already decided, before rising, exactly what he intends to do, and he stepped out into the aisle just as Eleanor reached the point where his pew stood, so that she could not pass him without either stopping or pushing rudely by. And Eleanor Vance was not a woman who pushed rudely by anyone, however great her wish to be anywhere else on earth at that moment. "Miss Vance." His voice was not loud, but it carried, because every other sound in that church had died away to nothing the instant he stood. "A moment, if you would permit me." She looked at him. I could see her face clearly from where I sat, and I saw the effort it cost her to compose it, to meet the eyes of a duke when she had just been shamed in front of the only society she had ever known. "Your Grace," she said, with a small, stiff incline of her head, "I fear I am not fit company for anyone just now." "On the contrary," he said, "I think you are fit company for a great many things, Miss Vance, and I have thought so for rather longer than is perhaps proper for me to admit in a church full of witnesses." He glanced briefly at the vicar, who I noticed, and this detail did not strike me as significant until much later, did not look nearly so astonished as everyone else in the room. "Reverend Cotter, I believe we discussed a contingency some weeks ago, in the event that my suspicions regarding this match proved founded." The vicar cleared his throat. "We did, Your Grace." I did not understand, in that moment, what contingency could possibly have been discussed between a duke and a vicar regarding another man's wedding, and I do not think anyone else in the church understood it either, judging by the ripple of confused whispering that went through the pews. But Eleanor understood enough to go quite still, her bouquet held before her like a shield, her eyes fixed on the Duke's face with an expression I can only describe as wary hope fighting for space against wary suspicion, in roughly equal measure. "I will not insult you," the Duke said, "by pretending this is the moment either of us would have chosen for such a conversation, but I find I cannot in good conscience let you walk out of this church alone and disgraced when I have it entirely in my power to prevent it. Miss Vance, I am asking you here now, before everyone who has just witnessed how poorly you were served by a man unworthy of you, to marry me instead." Today. This hour, if the vicar is willing, and I believe he is. The silence that followed was the kind of silence I have only otherwise heard in a sick room in the last moments before a passing, total, suspended, every soul in the building holding its breath at once. Somewhere near the front, I heard Cordelia Whitmore's father's solicitor drop his folio, and the small slap of leather on stone seemed as loud as a gunshot. Alina did not answer at once, and I loved her for that delay, small as it was, because a lesser woman, a more desperate woman, would have said yes before he finished the sentence, simply for the relief of it, simply to escape the humiliation pooling around her feet. She did not do that. She looked at him, really looked, the way I imagined she looked at a new specimen under her father's glass, weighing it, testing its structure before she would consent to name it, and she said, "You are offering this out of pity, Your Grace, and I will not be any man's charity." "I am offering it," he said, "out of a year's acquaintance with your mind and your courage, neither of which I have ever seen you display more plainly than in the last 10 minutes. Pity is not a feeling I associate with admiration, Miss Vance, and I have admired you for a good deal longer than pity could explain." I saw her breath catch. I saw, too, the flush that rose in her cheeks was no longer only the flush of humiliation. "You do not know me," she said, though it came out softer now, less a challenge than a genuine uncertainty. "I know that you can name every wildflower in that bouquet and tell me why you chose each one," he said. "I know you have read your father's monograph on the hedgerow plants of this county twice over correcting his Latin, because I have heard you do it aloud at the village hall from the back row, where you did not notice me sitting. I know that you did not weep just now, when a lesser woman would have. I know a great deal more of you than you imagine, Miss Vance, and none of it inclines me to pity. All of it inclines me to ask you this question, publicly, so that no one in this county may ever again mistake what you are worth. I will confess to you now, as an old man long past the age of embarrassment over his own sentiment, that my eyes were not dry through the whole of this exchange, and I was not alone. I heard sniffling from several pews, and even old Vance, who had been standing rigid and furious near the altar rail through the whole scene, had gone quite silent, his anger transmuting itself visibly into something like astonished hope. Alina looked past the Duke, for one moment, at her father, and something passed between them, some old, wordless conversation that fathers and daughters have without needing speech for it, and Josiah Vance gave the smallest nod, the kind of nod a man gives when he trusts his daughter's judgment more than his own and wants her to know it. "If I say yes," Alina said, turning back to the Duke, and her voice had steadied now, had found again the plain, clear register I imagined she used when she corrected her father's Latin, "I will not say it to save my pride, Your Grace, nor because I am too frightened to walk out of this church alone. I am entirely capable of walking out of this church alone. I have walked through worse with less." "I do not doubt it," he said. "I would not have asked you if I doubted it." "Then I will say it," she said, "because I find in this most unlikely hour that I believe you mean it. The church, I am told by those better placed than I to have heard it clearly, erupted, though erupted is too violent a word for what was, in truth, a kind of collective exhale, a ripple of gasps and whispers, and from somewhere in the back, someone beginning to clap before being hushed by a neighbor who felt clapping premature. The vicar, to his everlasting credit, moved with the brisk efficiency of a man who had, indeed, been quietly preparing for exactly this contingency, and within the half-hour, after Cordelia Whitmore and her furs and her father's solicitor had made a retreat rather less dignified than their entrance, and after Aldous Pemberton had slunk out a side door that I am glad to say no one troubled to hold open for him, Alina Vance became, in that same church, before most of the same witnesses, the Duchess of Harrogate. She wore the same gown. She carried the same bouquet, a little wilted now from the strain of the morning, but no one who saw her face at that second altar standing would have called her diminished by anything that had gone before. If anything, she stood straighter than she had the first time, because this time she was not walking toward a man's convenience. She was walking, deliberately, eyes open, toward a bargain she had chosen to test and found, on brief but careful examination, sound. I will not pretend that the county did not talk. Of course it talked. It talked for years and talks still, I dare say, in certain parlors where the story has been softened and sharpened by turns until it scarcely resembles what I saw with my own eyes. But I was there, and I can tell you plainly, there was no scandal in it beyond the scandal Pemberton and the Whitmores had already made. There was only a woman who had been humiliated finding, in the very ruins of that humiliation, a man who had watched her long enough and closely enough to know precisely what he was gaining, and who was not too proud, nor too cold, nor too correct, to say so in front of everyone. It was some weeks later, when I was called out to Harrogate to look in on an ague that had settled on the housekeeper, that I had the chance to speak with the new Duchess at any length, and it is from those conversations, and others across that first year, that I am able to fill in what I did not see from my pew that morning. The part of the story that happened before the wedding, and the part that happened after in the quiet of the estate, where the truest part of any marriage generally is decided. Harrogate itself was not the cold pile its reputation suggested. I had expected, given the Duke's manner and his epithet, a house of shut curtains and shadowed halls, and I found instead a great gray stone house with excellent light in its principal rooms and gardens that had been let run rather wilder than fashion generally permitted. I remarked on this to the Duchess. I will call her that now, though in my own mind she remained, and remains, simply a leaner, and she laughed, the first truly easy laugh I had heard from her since the wedding. "That is my doing," she said. "Gerald gave me the West Gardens within a fortnight of our marrying, and told me I might do with them what I pleased, provided I did not uproot the old cedar his grandfather planted. I have been let loose on them ever since, and Mrs. Trevec despairs of me daily. I have replaced 2 full beds of bedding out annuals with native species. You should see what I have found growing wild in the old orchard wall. A species of toadflax I do not believe has been properly recorded in this county at all." I asked her, as gently as an old family friend may ask such a thing, how she had settled to the marriage itself, given how strangely and swiftly it had begun, and she grew thoughtful in a way that told me she had turned the question over privately many times before I ever put it to her aloud. "I will tell you something odd," she said. "I did not fall in love with him in the church. I want that understood because I know how the story is told now, as though I looked at him once and swooned with gratitude. It was not like that at all. I married him that morning because I believed, on the evidence available to me in that moment, that he meant what he said, and because I would rather have tested that belief as his wife than spent the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had simply walked out those doors alone. I am my father's daughter. I do not take things on faith. I take them on evidence, and gather more evidence as I go." "And the evidence since?" I asked. She smiled, a private, considering smile, the kind a woman gives when she is deciding how much of her heart to show a family friend, and how much to keep for herself. "The evidence since," she said, "has been considerable." She told me then a little of what I had not known, and what the Duke himself confirmed to me directly on a later visit, when a bout of low spirits following a hard winter brought me out to Harrogate more than once, and gave us occasion for longer talk than dukes and physicians generally permit themselves. He had known Aliner's mother. It was true, in his boyhood, that much of the county's understanding was accurate. But his attendance at village lectures on native flora, and at the small gatherings where old Vance read his findings aloud to whatever handful of neighbors could be persuaded to listen, had begun rather more than a year before the wedding, not out of any obligation to a dead friend of his mother's, but because he had happened, by chance, to attend one such lecture in the company of a cousin who had dragged him there as a diversion, and had found himself unable to look away from the woman correcting her father's Latin from the second row, with a kind of unself-conscious passion. he had not encountered in any drawing room in a decade. "I did not intend to fall into the habit of attending," he told me, in that dry, precise way he had of admitting to feeling without ever quite surrendering his reserve. "But I found myself doing it regardless, month after month, always seated at the back, always telling myself it was merely an idle evening's entertainment. It took me longer than I care to admit to understand that I had begun arranging my calendar around the dates of those lectures." "And you said nothing to her in all that time?" "What was there to say?" He looked at me with something almost like self-mockery, which I had not thought him capable of before that winter. "She was engaged to Pemberton within the first few months of my noticing her, and I am not a man who intrudes on another man's courtship, however poorly I thought of the man doing the courting. I disliked Pemberton from the moment I met him at some assembly or other. There was a calculation in him that I have learned, in my own dealings, to recognize and distrust. I made some quiet inquiries, as one does, about his circumstances and his family's debts, and I did not like what I found. But suspicion is not proof, and I had no right to interfere in an engagement on the strength of a bad feeling and a distaste for the fellow's manner. Until you had rather better than a bad feeling. Till 3 weeks before the wedding," he said, "when I learned, through channels I will not trouble you with, that Pemberton had already begun a correspondence with a Miss Whitmore of considerable fortune, and that the correspondence was considerably warmer than mere acquaintance would explain. I could not prove, at that time, that he intended to abandon Miss Vance at the altar itself. I confess I did not expect quite so theatrical a betrayal, nor that the Whitmores would arrive with such theatrical timing. I expected, if anything, a quiet breaking of the engagement beforehand, some manufactured excuse. But I did not trust him to behave honorably in whatever form his betrayal took, and I did not trust myself to sit by and do nothing if I saw her humiliated in front of the whole county without any recourse prepared for her." "So you went to the vicar?" "I went to Reverend Cotter," he said, "and I told him plainly what I suspected, and I asked him if the worst befell, if Pemberton showed his true colors before the vows were spoken, whether he would be willing and canonically able to perform a second ceremony that same day, should Miss Vance consent to it. I did not know that she would consent. I want that understood as clearly as she herself insists upon it. I prepared the possibility. I did not presume the outcome. I would not have forced my company on her grief, had she wished only to leave that church and never see me again. I would have let her go and grieved the loss of it privately, as I had grieved a good many things privately by then. I was curious, too, about Reverend Cotter's part in all this, for a vicar does not lightly agree to hold a second wedding in reserve behind a first, and I sought him out myself that same winter, over a glass of the Duke's excellent sherry in the vicarage parlor, to ask what had passed between them. "I will tell you, Doctor, that I very nearly refused him," Cotter said, settling into his chair with the particular weariness of a man who has spent 30 years marrying, burying, and christening the same families over and over until he half believes he has lived all their lives alongside his own. "It is not a small thing to prepare a wedding license for a woman who does not know she may need one, and to keep silent about it besides. I asked His Grace whether he was quite certain he was not merely inventing a suspicion to justify an interest he had long nursed and never acted upon. He did not take offense at the question, which told me a good deal in itself. A vainer man would have blustered. He simply answered it, plainly, with the evidence he had gathered on Pemberton's correspondence, and I found I could not, in conscience, refuse to prepare for the possibility once I had heard him out. I told myself I was merely being a careful shepherd of my flock, seeing to it that no lamb of this parish was left without shelter if the storm broke as he feared it might. And when the storm did break, I confess my hands were not entirely steady, the vicar said, with a small, rueful laugh. I had the second license ready in the vestry drawer for the better part of 3 weeks, and I had begun to think I should simply burn it quietly come summer and never mention the matter to a living soul, since Pemberton gave no outward sign of wavering in all that time. When the Whitmores came through those doors, I own my first thought was pure professional horror at the wreck being made of a sacrament in my own church, and it was several seconds before I remembered the drawer, and the license, and what His Grace had asked of me. I do not mind telling you, Doctor, that I said a private and rather hurried prayer of thanks when Miss Vance gave her answer, for I do not think my conscience could have borne watching her walk out those doors with nothing at all waiting for her, when I had it in my power, however awkwardly gained, to see that something did. I asked him whether he had ever doubted the Duke's sincerity in the matter, whether a vicar, schooled in every manner of human weakness that walks through a church door, had wondered if a duke's sudden proposal to a jilted woman might spring from pride, or from the theater of the gesture, rather than from anything so patient as a year's quiet devotion. I wondered it for exactly as long as it took him to say her name, Cotter admitted. There is a way a man says a name he has carried privately for a long while, Doctor, and a way he says a name merely to fill a silence, and I have heard both often enough in 30 years of marrying strangers to each other that I no longer mistake one for the other. His Grace said Miss Vance's name the first way. I had no more doubts after that, whatever doubts I confess to having entertained beforehand, and I do not believe I have officiated at a match since that has settled so happily as that one, for all its dreadful beginning. I thought of that conversation often in the years afterward, whenever the county's gossip embroidered the story past recognition, turning the vicar into a mere convenient instrument, and the Duke into a figure of pure theatrical rescue, as though a year of careful, silent watching and a vicar's own quiet courage had counted for nothing at all in what took place that morning. They counted for a great deal, I think. A rescue arranged in 3 weeks of careful suspicion, and a vicar willing to risk his own comfort to prepare for a contingency he could not be certain would ever arrive, are not the stuff of theater. They are the stuff of ordinary decency, quietly practiced, which is a rarer and better thing than theater by far. I asked him, for I am an old man and permitted a certain bluntness, whether it had not been an extraordinary risk, offering marriage to a woman in the very hour of her public humiliation, with no certainty of her answer and every possibility of compounding her shame, if she refused him before the same crowd that had just watched Pemberton refuse her. It was the greatest risk I have taken in my life, he said, without hesitation. Greater than any wager, greater than any decision I have made regarding the estate or the tenants or anything else that has passed through my hands since my brother's death. I stood in that pew for the length of perhaps 3 heartbeats deciding whether to rise at all, and I want to tell you honestly, Doctor, that I nearly did not. I have spent a great many years training myself not to want things I could not be certain of obtaining. It is not a comfortable habit, but it is a safe one, and safety had become rather more important to me than I like to admit, after my brother's death taught me how quickly a man's whole life can be rearranged by a single morning's misfortune. But I looked at her walking back down that aisle with her spine straight and her chin high, refusing to let them see her broken, and I understood that if I let her walk out those doors without at least offering her the choice, I would spend the rest of my life exactly as safe and exactly as empty as I had been every day since Edmund died. I chose the risk. I have never regretted a decision less. I have set down his words as near as memory allows, and I believe I have them close to exact, for that conversation stayed with me vividly through the years since, in the way certain conversations do, the ones that explain, at last, something you had wondered about for a long while without knowing you were wondering. Their courtship, if I may call it that, having occurred so thoroughly backward from the usual order, marriage first, courtship after, was a slow and careful thing in that first year, conducted in the manner of 2 people determined to build honestly what circumstance had thrust upon them so suddenly. I visited Harrogate perhaps a dozen times that year on one pretext or another, some medical, some merely social, and I watched the 2 of them shift, month by month, from a kind of careful courtesy into something warmer, though neither of them was inclined to display it loudly. I remember one visit in particular, in the early autumn following their marriage, when I came upon them in the west garden that Eleanor had made so thoroughly her own. She was on her knees in the dirt, quite without regard for the fine gown she wore, examining some low-growing plant with the absorbed concentration I had seen in her at the village lectures, and the Duke was crouched beside her, not merely watching, but listening, as she explained to him the particular arrangement of its leaves, and why she believed it to be a variety her father's monograph had recorded only once, decades before, in a hedgerow 3 parishes distant. "You will ruin that gown," he said, though there was no real reproach in it. "I have several gowns," she said, "and only one specimen of linaria in fruit this late in the season. I know which I value more today." He laughed an actual laugh, low and startled out of him, as though the sound surprised him as much as it might have surprised anyone who knew his reputation for coldness. And he reached down, and, with a care that told me a great deal about the state of things between them, brushed a fleck of garden soil from her cheek with his thumb before either of them seemed to remember I was standing at the garden gate observing the whole tender scene. They both colored at being caught in so unguarded a moment, and Eleanor rose rather too quickly, brushing at her skirts, and the Duke straightened and greeted me with his customary reserve restored. But I had seen it, that flash of ease and warmth between them, and I understood then that whatever had begun as a rescue in a country church had grown, quietly and without fanfare, into something neither of them would any longer call merely a bargain. I asked her once, that same visit, whether she had found in the Duke the equal she had hoped for I knew her well enough by then to know that equality of mind mattered to her more than title or fortune ever could. "He reads my father's monographs," she told me, "not out of politeness, but because he wishes to understand what I care about, and he asks questions that show he has actually understood the answers I gave him previously. Do you know how rare that is, Doctor? Aldous never once asked me a question about my father's work that he troubled himself to remember the answer to. Gerald remembers everything. He remembered, months after I mentioned it only once, that I had wished to see the fossil beds near the coast, and he arranged the whole excursion himself, quietly, without telling me until the carriage was already ordered." "That sounds like a man in love," I said. "It sounds," she said, with that same considering smile, "like a man showing me evidence, Doctor, since he knows very well by now that evidence is the only courtship I ever properly trust." I laughed at that, and told her I thought her father would be proud to hear his methods so faithfully applied to matters of the heart, and she said that her father had, in fact, told her much the same thing, and had moreover taken enormous satisfaction in the Duke's patronage of his continuing botanical work. For it was true, and worth recording here, that one of the earliest and most lasting changes the marriage brought about was a steady support for old Josiah Vance's cataloging. Published now under the Harrogate name, with proper engravings and proper distribution, so that the work of 30 patient years finally found the audience it had always deserved. I do not think Eleanor ever thanked her husband for anything so warmly, in my hearing, as she thanked him the day the first bound copies arrived from the printer, and I do not think the Duke, in turn, ever looked prouder of anything he had purchased with his fortune than he did watching her run her hands over her father's name embossed in gold on the spine. I have not yet told you enough of old Josiah Vance's part in all this, and I think it wants telling, for a father's grief and a father's gladness were as much a part of that year as anything that passed between the Duke and his new Duchess. Josiah had aged a decade, I think, in the 10 minutes between Pemberton's confession and the Duke's rising, and I watched him age a decade backward again in the 10 minutes after Eleanor gave her answer. He was not a man given to strong outward feeling. 30 years of patient, solitary cataloging teaches a man to hold himself very still and let the world reveal itself slowly. But I saw his hands shake around his hat brim through the whole of that second, hastier ceremony, and I saw him weep, quite without shame, when the vicar pronounced his daughter a duchess. He had raised her alone since Margaret's death when Alina was but 9 years old, had taught her his Latin and his patience and his stubborn insistence on evidence over appearance. And I think that morning he believed, for one terrible quarter hour, that all of it had been for nothing, that he had raised a daughter too honest and too plain-spoken for the world to properly value, and had watched the world prove him right in the cruelest possible fashion. To see her lifted up again within the same hour, and lifted up by a man who valued the very qualities Pemberton had been too shallow to see, undid him more completely than the humiliation itself had done. I called on him at his cottage some weeks after the wedding, ostensibly to look in on a chest complaint that troubled him every winter, and found him instead in remarkably good spirits, surrounded by proof sheets from a printer in the county town. "The Duke has taken it upon himself to see my monograph properly published," he told me, showing me the pages with the pride of a man half his age. "Engravings, Doctor, proper engravings of my own drawings and distribution beyond this parish for the first time in 30 years of work." I told him I did not marry my daughter to him for the sake of patronage, and he told me he knew that perfectly well, and that this was not patronage at all, but simple justice long overdue a man whose work deserved it on its own merits. I do not know that I have ever been so entirely without words in my life, and you know me, Doctor, I am rarely without words. "He admires you as much as he admires her, I think," I said. "He admires the method," Josiah said, "the same method I gave to Alina, and I confess I did not expect a duke to have any patience for it. Most men of his rank want conclusions handed to them dressed in confidence. He wants to see the specimen itself, examine it, ask his own questions before he will name it. I have not met above 2 or 3 men in my life with that particular patience, and I raised one of them myself, and did not expect to find the other married into my family by such a strange back door." He set the proof sheets down and looked at me with an old man's frank and unguarded gratitude. "I feared for her so, Doctor, in those 10 minutes at the front of that church. I feared I had failed her utterly in trusting a man so poorly. I do not feel that failure now. I feel only that the county misjudged her for years, and that one man alone had the sense to judge her rightly, and I am content to call that one man my son." I left the cottage that afternoon with a lightness I had not expected to feel over a mere chest complaint, and I thought, as I drove my gig back along the lane toward the village, that I had rarely seen a father's private vindication so complete, nor so quietly earned. There is one further scene I must set down, because it completes the story properly, and because I was fortunate enough to witness it myself, some 18 months after the wedding, at a county assembly that both the Duke and Duchess of Harrogate attended together. One of the first such public gatherings they had graced since the scandal, for Alina had been in no hurry to parade herself before a society that had watched her humiliated, and the Duke had respected that reluctance without ever pressing her toward it. Aldous Pemberton was there. I will not pretend the county had entirely forgotten him, nor that his marriage to Cordelia Whitmore, which had gone forward within the year, as such mercenary matches generally do, had spared him the quiet contempt of neighbors who valued loyalty more than he had ever understood. He approached Alina that evening, I think meaning some manner of awkward reconciliation, or perhaps merely wishing to test whether her elevation had softened her enough to receive his overtures kindly. "Your Grace," he said, with a bow that tried for ease and did not entirely achieve it, "I hope you know I never intended you any particular unkindness. Circumstances—" "Mr. Pemberton," Alina said, and there was no anger in her voice at all, which I think unsettled him rather more than anger would have done. "I bear you no grudge. You did me the greatest kindness of my life, though I do not suppose you intended it as one." He blinked at her, plainly uncertain how to receive this. I am glad you feel no ill will." "I feel none," she said, "because I have exactly what I want, and you, I think, have exactly what you were always so determined to have. I hope Miss Whitmore's fortune brings you the contentment you valued above me. I have found that my own contentment required rather less money and rather more honesty than you were ever able to offer." She glanced across the room, to where the Duke stood in conversation with her father, and something in her face softened entirely out of the cool courtesy she had been using on Pemberton. "I did not know when I walked up that aisle the first time what I truly wanted from a husband. I know it very well now, and I have him. Good evening, Mr. Pemberton." She left him standing there, and I confess I took no small satisfaction in watching him retreat toward the refreshment table, looking very much like a man who had gone hunting for triumph, and come away with nothing but the bitter taste of his own poor judgment. I made my way to the Duke soon after, and found him watching his wife across the room with an expression he no longer troubled to hide from old family friends, whatever mask he still wore for the wider county. "She handled him better than I would have," he said, when he saw me notice the direction of his gaze. I confess I wished to cross the room and say a good deal less civil a thing to him than anything I imagined she said. "She said she bore him no grudge," I told him, because he had done her the greatest kindness of her life without meaning it. The Duke was quiet a moment, watching Eleanor laugh at something her father was saying, her whole face lit with an unguarded warmth that no one who had seen her only in that first terrible hour at St. Aldrich's would have recognized as the same woman. "She is generous," he said, "to call it kindness. I call it the greatest fortune of my own life, that a fool did not know what he held, and I was standing near enough and foolish enough myself for love to reach for it before it was lost." I have thought of that sentence many times in the years since, turning it over the way Eleanor herself might have turned over some new specimen brought in from the hedgerow, examining it from every angle before I was satisfied I understood its full meaning. I believe I do understand it now, as well as any man outside a marriage can understand the private truths that sustain it. He did not save her that day, not truly. However dramatic his rising from that pew must have looked to the congregation holding its breath. She saved herself first, by refusing to weep, by walking out with her chin high and her dignity entirely her own, needing no man's rescue to preserve it. What he did, in stopping her at the door, was something humbler and in its way braver than rescue. He asked to be allowed to walk beside a woman who had already proven she did not need him, on the wager that she might nonetheless want him. She did want him in time, and wants him still, by every account I have had of Harrogate in all the years since, a household of native wildflowers grown bold along old stone walls, of monographs printed under a duke's patronage and a naturalist's name, of a marriage that began in scandal and settled, as the truest marriages do, into something far quieter and far more durable than the drama of its first hour ever suggested it could become. I was there in the fourth pew when it began, an old physician with his black bag at his feet, expecting nothing more that morning than to watch a plain, good woman married off to a man unworthy of her. I did not expect to watch her claimed instead by a duke who had loved her in silence for a year, nor to understand, only slowly, over years of quiet visits and quieter confidences, that the truest proposals are not always the ones rehearsed in private, but sometimes the ones spoken aloud in a moment of crisis, when a man has run out of time to be anything but honest. I ought to add one further detail, small in itself, which I did not learn until several years after the events I have described, and which I think completes the picture better than any grand summary I could offer of my own. It was Eleanor herself who told me, on a visit I made to Harrogate the autumn before I set this account down, that she had kept the wildflower bouquet from that terrible, wonderful morning, or rather, what remained of it. She showed me, pressed carefully between the pages of one of her father's own ledgers, the rosemary and the forget-me-not and the sprig of yarrow, flattened now and browned with age, but still recognizably themselves, still arranged in the order she had chosen them. I could have thrown it out 100 times, she told me, turning the brittle pages with the same careful reverence she gave every specimen that passed through her hands. It withered within the week, of course, as all cut flowers do. But I found I could not part with it, because it was the one thing I carried with me through both ceremonies that morning, the same rosemary, the same yarrow, whether I was walking toward Aldous Pemberton or away from him and into whatever Gerald was offering. It seemed to me later a kind of proof that I had not changed in the space of that hour, whatever else had changed around me. I was the same woman carrying the same flowers. Only the man waiting for me at the end of the aisle was worth the walking. I asked her whether the Duke knew she had kept it. He found it years ago, quite by accident, looking for a book on his own shelves, she said, with a small, private laugh. He has never once mentioned it to me directly, though I know he saw it, because the ledger was in a different place on the shelf the next morning than I had left it, turned so the spine faced outward, as though someone had wished to be able to find it again easily. I have never asked him why. Some things, Doctor, are better left as evidence gathered quietly and never spoken aloud. My father taught me that much, too, that not every observation needs to be announced to be treasured. I set this account down now because I am old, and because the story has been told so many ways in the county's parlors that I wished, before my own memory grows as unreliable as gossip, to leave behind the version I saw with my own eyes. The version in which a jilted bride did not need saving, but was loved enough and seen clearly enough by a man brave enough at last to say so, that she chose, freely and with her eyes wide open, to be claimed.